How is The Surge going to be remembered? A Dark Souls science fiction clone, or a game that really introduces something truly special to stand on its own? The best way to answer that is to play it firsthand and let the game surprise you. So in this review, I'm going to make sure not to spoil anything, nor show any critical game content past the first few levels, because the beauty of a Souls-like game is that first magical playthrough, and I don't want to ruin that for anybody. So what can you expect from The Surge? The Surge is a third-person science fiction action role-playing game in which you play as a character named Warren, a crippled human being living in a future where machines have replaced the need for human existence. After a brief cutscene that explains very little, you are dropped off in a wasteland environment and the game begins. There's really no other context in the game, it's a very cryptic story. Much like in Dark Souls, you are in charge of piecing it together by interacting with audio logs, conversations via message terminals, and some choice voiceovers that trigger when you cross certain thresholds of the environments.
This has been again. I'm still waiting at the outbound station.
While the picture of mankind's dystopian future would be a great backdrop for an amazing story here, sadly in The Surge, it's something that quickly gets shoved under the rug. And Warren himself is extremely boring and one-dimensional, as are the conversations you have with NPCs.
For a moment I thought you were one of these psychos. Already ran into a dozen or so of them today. Guess I've always attracted the wrong type of guy.
One thing that fans of Souls games should be aware of is that Warren is a preset lead. There is no character creator, no choices of classes nor genders, and I think that really hurts The Surge. The benefit of having a predefined lead here is that it allows the developer to have a protagonist that speaks and develop him or her throughout the story. But unfortunately, there is really no development. Conversations are awkward, thin, and poorly delivered. Warren himself has no emotion, nor shows any of it. He shows no fear or sorrow outside the main cutscene, questions very little, and seems to be perfectly fine existing as a super-powered transformer, dead set on destroying everything he sees. This reminds me of Dark Souls 2, where you pretty much embark on this quest to kill the most powerful beings in existence without ever being explained anything or question any of it. It was kind of silly if you think about it. Dark Souls did the same thing, however it did give you an actual reason to play in the eyes of the main character. Oscar saves you in the introduction scene by throwing down a key for you to escape. He ultimately dies soon after, but not before asking you to fulfill the prophecy and succeed Gwen. Some players will probably buy into that, and that's cool, but others may simply want to honor the dying wish of a man who had saved them. Either way, it made you want to see the quest of Dark Souls through. The Surge in its essence is a survivor's story, a perfect setting to bleed that critical element of humanity into the equation, but the characters, the story, Warren himself and the spoken dialogue are so underdeveloped. And other than a small explanation that machines are just taking over humanity, there is very little context here for you to really care about what's going on or Warren himself. Combat in The Surge is, for the most part, nearly identical to Dark Souls and Lords of the Fallen, yet there are a few new additions that change things up slightly. In replace of heavy and light attacks, Warren can now swing vertically and horizontally, and you cannot use one-handed weapons in both hands to increase its damage. I have to say I don't like this change. It has an adverse effect on weapon diversity. If you remember in Dark Souls, weapons felt very distinct because some of them had very little vertical capability, such as rapiers, spears, or lances, which were used best at horizontal thrusting. They could be very powerful, but the game also compensated for this by reducing your ability to attack vertically in return. I think this is very important because it promotes player choice given that trade-off. And I think the developers understood this relationship because of how combos work in The Surge. There are natural combo strings in The Surge. It's nothing complicated or technical, you simply mash the attack buttons and combos happen automatically, and every weapon has distinct animations, so in this fashion, the weapons do feel quite different in execution. However, that has nothing to do with mechanics or player choice. Another benefit of the weapon system in the Surge is that you have more well-rounded weapons, knowing that you always have horizontal and vertical options no matter what weapon you choose. Personally, I just don't think this trade-off is the way to go. It just creates too much homogenization between weapons. Further compounding the issue, the Surge really encourages you to choose a weapon style and stick with it, as you level up your proficiencies over time by using said weapon style. That simply means, if you find a kick-ass one-handed weapon and you've been two-handing all game long, especially one you've heavily upgraded, you're better off not even equipping it. It discourages experimentation. Yes, it does create uniqueness in playstyle, but at the cost of flexibility and gameplay diversity. But with that said, however, combat as a whole in the Surge is great. It just feels really good. Weapons have a lot of weight and impact behind them, especially when you smash the hell out of the armor off your enemies. The most unique feature of the combat in the Surge is your ability to target individual parts of the enemy body. In theory, it's a great system. Blue targets represent unarmored areas, and if you focus them, fighting is easier. You do more damage, and you have a greater chance to stagger and stun lock enemies, which is very useful. Yellow targets represent armored areas, and if you focus them, fighting is harder, but you may execute them by holding X on a controller when prompted to knock off the armor and take it for yourself. These animations are pretty goddamn awesome, but during the windup you do not have invincibility frames, so there will come a time where you have to decide to execute them for the item and risk taking damage or ignore the prompt altogether. I like this system, however, it does create very black and white gameplay. Target yellow areas if you want items, and target blue areas if you want to live. The upgrades and schematics you get from executing enemies will go towards crafting gear at a medical bay, which is basically a Dark Souls bonfire. But unlike Dark Souls, each area has only one medical bay, which you find pretty much at the start of each level, so it's a little bit different. Each upgrade will cost you both tech scrap, which is the equivalent of souls in Dark Souls, and rare materials you find out in the world. But tech scrap also goes to increasing your power level, so just like in Dark Souls, you have to make the same choice. Do you want to upgrade your power level or upgrade and craft new weapons? Upgrading your power level will give you access to more implant sockets, which you can equip with various things like healing salves, increased HP, increased weapon damage, and even an ability that makes a very, very annoying sound when items are nearby. I'll be the first to admit that I believe The Surge is a more challenging game mechanically and mentally than any Dark Souls game for two reasons. First, there are no easy mobs in The Surge. In fact, The Surge focuses on normal enemies way more than it does bosses. You won't find many compared to a Dark Souls game. Now, every enemy has the ability to kill you in like 2 or 3 hits, and the telegraphing on these enemies can be very tricky at first. You might die a lot. And secondly, the levels in The Surge are smaller and far more claustrophobic. They're basically mazes. For better or worse, The Surge is a series of these very small, very dense areas interconnected through a main hub. The result is a world that feels more consistent at the cost of feeling more open and diverse. This is by far one of my biggest problems that I have with The Surge. Most of the areas look very similar, they all have this very factory-like look to them, and there is very little environmental diversity. However, when the game does send you underground, the lighting effects and the use of darkness can make The Surge feel very immersive at times and disguise the sense of environmental fatigue. Because each area is so dense and the enemies are so hard, I think a lot of players may be incentivized to run past most enemies, to find that switch or that console to open up that critical door necessary to advance to the next area or boss. Fans of the Souls games may relish in the tension that results from this equation. However, I'm going to assume that the intense difficulty in the smaller, maze-like level design of The Surge is going to turn off a lot of other players, especially more average or casual players. The Surge runs like a dream, rarely if ever dipping below 60 frames per second. Customization in the graphics menu is also very solid. Keyboard and controller keys are fully rebindable, and there are a good amount of options to customize your gameplay experience. However, there is no FOV slider present in The Surge, and I think that is a pretty nasty omission given how close the camera is to the character. It's often just too close. and most of the levels in the Surge are indoors and cramped, which only amplifies the issue. Would love to see a patch to customize the FOV. Now on a technical level, the Surge is competent, but it's nothing special. Textures are okay, and the fidelity is on par with, let's say, Lords of the Fallen. I have to admit, I was craving some of those wow moments, the Boreal Valley, or Lothric Castle in Dark Souls 3, or Dragon Eyrie in Dark Souls 2. Those really epic levels with that huge sense of scale, it's just not here in the Surge. Now granted, the game does have some amazing lighting effects, especially in low-lit areas. Now once again, as with Lords of the Fallen, the soundtrack in the Surge is completely forgettable, as is nearly all of the voice acting. However, the sound effects are crunchy and satisfying. Every audio asset does fit the theme of the game too, this kind of robotic, synthetic vibe that the Surge has going on. So overall, the Surge does get the job done in the visual and auditory departments, but I wasn't blown away by any stretch, not even close. The Surge is a good game. It has competent mechanics, but it's nothing revolutionary. I mostly enjoyed my 25 hours with it, but I'm not compelled to play through the game again. The Surge copies the Dark Souls formula to the T, introduces a multi-targeting combat system, throws on a sci-fi paint job, and shrinks the scale at which the game exists. So if you enjoy Souls games, I think this game will do a decent job giving you what you want. The gameplay is enjoyable and the performance is great. Now if you're new to these kinds of games, I would pick up Demon or Dark Souls instead. For everyone else wanting something really new from the Souls concept, I don't believe it is here with the Surge. My recommendation is to pick up this game at a sale of around $35. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, by all means hit the thumbs up button for me and subscribe here for more of our future content. And you guys have a kick-ass day. We'll see you next time.